welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, and joining me on set is Father Joseph Mary Wolfe for this book interview, talking about Mother Angelica, A Guide to Practical Holiness, the latest one published by EWTN Publishing. This is the final one of the mini books being put out. And thank you so much, Father Joseph. You've done a great job over the years being the spokesperson for these particular books. And this is the last one in the series based upon Mother's mini books, ultimately be available as a set, and people can order those through EWTN's religious catalog, and something the sisters have been waiting a long time to see happen and come to fruition. Now, what's interesting in this Guide to Practical Holiness, I always think of Mother being very, very practical, but it's sometimes interesting to see how deep spiritually she is in that practicality.
Yeah, and it's two elements really of the saints' lives often, that you see that they were people who had a deep contemplative life, and of course Mother Angelica was a contemplative, that was her vocation. And yet this practicality of putting it into action. So it's not just on a theoretical level, right? We don't want to remain just on a theoretical level, but faith, through working through love, as St. Paul says, putting it into action.
Well, it's kind of interesting. The first one featured in this particular Guide to Practical Holiness is the smallest, shortest one of her mini books. It's about 5.5 pages, and if I recall right, it's actually a couple of inches by a couple of inches. It actually is a little thing entitled, Holiness in a Nutshell. Now, I always think of Mother, selling the peanuts and things like that. I don't know if that related to it, but was there some attempt here to reach what she would view as the common man?
Yes, I think that was it. Just some very small practical ideas that, as she said, who is holiness for? That's how she begins this little mini book. Who's it for? It's for everyone. Well, where? At work, in school, whatever you're doing, in every place it's possible. Why? Because God loves you. But just some practical steps about how can you grow in holiness? Well, just be aware of God in the present moment. A lot of times we forget about God. We get so wrapped up in what we're doing and the things we're doing that we don't even give God a passing thought. But if we're aware of His presence, then it changes the atmosphere, right?
It's interesting too, because in a sense she points out that it's a way of turning disagreeable situations into good situations. So
just because you're having troubles, with somebody in your life, doesn't mean that that's not a moment for holiness. In fact, it's a practical moment to practice virtue, to see God in that moment, in that present moment, in this disagreeable situation, calling you to be more patient, more loving, more compassionate.
She also talks about in this one about uniting your will with God's will. I guess a lot of people would say, I'd love to do that, but how do I discern what His will is for me?
We find ourselves just wanting to carry out our own will, even if it's not for our own good. But that she goes through those struggles that are part of our spiritual life, part of our spiritual growth. But then it comes to this completion of His will in mine. And that's not something that diminishes us as human beings. Living in His will is actually going to be the thing that's going to make us flourish the best.
Right. It's not like we're being programmed and we don't have a decision to make. Now also, Mother, of course, because of her own devotion, talks about and hear about how important visiting the Eucharist is for people. How have you found that in your own personal life? And was that an experience you had that was important to you before you came to EWTN as an engineer, let alone becoming a priest?
So I came to know of the sisters through EWTN. I didn't really know about their life of adoration in the early days of the network, and I came down here, and one of the other engineers said, for Lent, you ought to go to daily Mass. Okay, so I went to daily Mass. At that time, it wasn't televised. There was about 8 of us that were there. And then I noticed that the Blessed Sacrament would be exposed. So then eventually going to daily Mass led to spending time in adoration and experiencing the Lord's presence. And I can say, especially as a priest and religious, that that's my greatest consolation, my greatest joy. And I know that Mother, she had difficulties outside and inside the church, in carrying out the mission that God had given her to do. But she always had solace. She always had a refuge before the Blessed Sacrament.
Right, and that was also, did she do her writing in front of the Blessed Sacrament as a rule?
So these mini books really sprang from that she would be praying, and she would say that the Lord would give her this light, and it would continue until that work was completed, and then when it was done, it was done. It was just, in one sitting, it would be a special light that the Lord gave her. And she saw it as a very practical way to give people just some very simple steps, that holiness is not this exalted thing that only a few people can achieve. But you and your circumstances of your life, the hardships, the troubles, it's not as if, okay, once I get these troubles out of the way, then I can grow in holiness. No, that's going to be the very thing that's going to help you to advance.
Right, that's what's making you holy. It's dealing with that and being refined by that fire.
Exactly.
That's actually helping you along the way. Now, in doing this and giving these kind of practical suggestions, it seems like Mother's goal is to show you that there'll be some positive practical benefits for the average person to pursue these, right?
So she even has this list of what you're going to experience if you're growing in holiness. So first of all, how are we going to grow in holiness? Well, it should be important to us that we do want it. So it's not just something that, okay, church is on Sunday and holiness really isn't something I'm interested in. But no, if we are pursuing holiness, we're going to actually see things changing for the better in our lives. And she says things like, there's going to be more harmony at home. You're going to have more strength to overcome your weaknesses. You're going to experience more compassion well up in your heart for others. You're going to experience a greater joy in the depths of your soul and peace even in the midst of the turmoil of your life.
Well, it's interesting too, because in you listing those things that Mother listed with the harmony, the idea of joy and peace being combined. And versus this kind of worldly happiness.
Right. So again, she would make that distinction between happiness and joy, that yes, our circumstances can make us happy in a natural sense, but if our circumstances are not good, then we can lose that happiness. But joy is something deeper. And of course, there's that in the Franciscan tradition, we have that perfect joy story in the life of St. Francis, where he says, we're going to get at the friary and they're going to reject us and throw us out in the snow. That's perfect joy if we still have peace in the midst of that. And Francis was saying joy and peace is something deeper than what the world can give you.
Right, and sometimes I think the trouble is people are looking to the world to give them that. And that's where they're misguided. Following that little section in a nutshell there is come follow me. Now, it seems like this is kind of speaking about a religious vocation. Is that the only reason to read something like this, if somebody's thinking about a religious vocation, or do you think it's more than that?
It's definitely something more than that, and yet at the same time it's something we give to guys who inquire into our own community, because it is more specifically about being called to a religious vocation. And as Mother herself says, it's not something you choose, but you are chosen. It's something that's accepted. You come to this awareness, God is calling me. And you have this desire within you, for those of us in the consecrated life, you want to give God everything. Somehow, giving Him less than everything isn't enough. He's planted that in your heart and your soul. At Mother Angelica's funeral,
and you had the homily.
I had the homily, and I began by saying, in order to understand Mother Angelica, you have to understand, you can't understand her without reference to the one she loved with the passion of a bride. She is first of all a religious. During her life, she was a religious, a consecrated woman who had dedicated her whole life to the Lord. And that was the whole thrust of what she did. It was for love of Him.
Right, and in a sense, the familial relationship she had with her sisters, and she saw her role in protecting and taking care of her sisters, and then broadening that kind of familial relationship out to the friars, and then out, obviously, to the entire EWTN family.
And we all had a sense of that, and I think it's still very much alive, isn't it, here at the network? It's grown, there's a lot more employees, and yet when I went on the road recently to Washington, D.C., and working with the employees over there and our own employees here, there really is a family spirit of concern for each other and caring for each other. Well, Mother Angelica taught us that. You know, this familial relationship, this concern, this love that we should have for each other.
Right. Well, sometimes, and it was interesting in alluding to what you were saying earlier in reading Mother's book, the idea that one can get the idea that, you know, religious people are better than the normal people, or religious vocations, this higher calling. And sometimes I think when people see a priest who's wearing your kind of garb, religious garb, or a sister who's in full habit, they think, well, the problem with that is you're trying to separate yourself to show how you're better than I am. That's not what Mother's talking about, and that's not true anyway.
It's not true anyway, and it was never something that was an emphasis for her. Really, that she sees that we are called by God to be signposts. We're pointing to God. We're pointing to heaven. We're pointing to the reality of another life. That this life is not all that there is. And so we are called to point to that life of heaven where there is no marrying or giving in marriage, but God is everything to us.
Right.
So that is to begin for us even now.
Right. And I would think, and I know myself years ago, before I even had my reconversion experience through marriage encounter, being in New York City, walking down to go to some meeting, could have been on the Playboy channel for all I know, but it had to do with some secular channel, and seeing a religious sister, a couple of sisters walk along, it made me stop. First of all, I was surprised. I hadn't seen a lot of sisters recently, but it made me think, oh, that's right. This isn't all there is.
Yeah.
There is something else there, and that's that sign. Right?
Whenever I'm flying and I'm waiting for a flight, I like to get some exercise, but I also like to see what might the Lord do. So I'm walking around, waiting for my flight, and often praying the rosary too. And I can't tell you the number of times people have come up, they've had questions. One young lady said, I know I don't need to go back to church, and I got to catch my flight, but I promise I'm going to go back to church. Another guy who wanted to go to confession, another young man who had questions about the faith. And so, yes, that's what we're to be. We're not here to say, you know, we're better than the rest of you. Get your acts together. But we're to be signposts that say, don't forget God.
Well, in a lot of ways, it would be easier for you personally if you weren't. If you were in mufti and walking through in a coat and tie, so that nobody would, quote unquote, bother you.
Yeah, sometimes you may think about that. But I always take the EWTN program guides with me too whenever I walk, because I see it as an opportunity. People have questions, and these program guides are ways in which they may touch, God may speak to them after my encounter with them.
So that's Come Follow Me. There's also one, Praying into Prayer. Now, we always think of Mother being a very prayerful, etc. What does she mean by praying into prayer?
Well, she's talking about the real struggles of prayer. So prayer, sometimes we have these exhilarating experiences, and we need those to help us to persevere. And God really manifests His presence, and we experience His love. But there are also these times of struggle where we may question, does God know? Does He care? Does He exist? These times of dryness and so on. So the struggle is part of our purification too, where we're not just looking for the consolations, but we're seeking God more sincerely, and our faith is actually growing in those times.
Do you think sometimes part of our problem is that we're looking for the idea of saying, I'm not getting anything out of this. You know, I'm doing this and I'm not getting anything out of it. And maybe you are, but you don't sense it, but also the idea that we owe something to the Lord too for everything He's done for us.
That's right. And it's just like going to Mass. It's not about, I'm not getting anything out of this. It's, what can I give? And thanksgiving for all the Lord has given to me.
But do you hear that a lot from people who say, well, I just don't get anything out of Mass?
Right, that's why I stopped going. Well, a lot of times they don't really understand the Mass, and as I often will say to them, think of the Mass as a gift. And it's a gift that's unopened, and it's waiting for you. But it's going to remain unopened until you come to receive it. So if you think of the Mass or confession as these gifts God wants to give you to give divine help in this life, then it has a whole different perspective. And then you're also there also to give praise and thanksgiving to
right,
God.
and sometimes you can even go to a parish and in a very nice way, thanking everybody for coming, etc., which is very nice on one level. It's very welcoming and friendly. On the other side, it's not like I'm doing God a favor.
Right.
But to some degree, it can almost sound like, well, you're doing him a favor by showing up, as if he needs you to be here.
It's interesting. There was a recent book about being bored at Mass, I think, and how that's beneficial for us too. The kind of the sameness sometimes, or we just kind of drift off, that we can enter more deeply into the mystery of God. God is mystery, right?
And even some secular things you hear about, like things called mindfulness or other things, which are really people thinking, I need to be able to have some time to myself to think, to meditate, quote unquote. Well, isn't that what the Mass gives you a great opportunity to do, let alone Eucharistic adoration, that opportunity to quiet oneself enough to listen to what God might be telling me in my own life?
And it's not just that, as good as that is, but God really is present.
Right.
In a powerful, profound way in the Mass.
Right.
And so there are ways in which he reveals himself to us in mysterious ways that go beyond words and concepts.
Right, and she also actually talks about the idea that praying, in a sense, increases the soul's capacity for God. What do you think she meant by that?
So we all, like she would sometimes describe our soul as being like a size of a quart. And then as it gets filled with God's life and grace, then he sees, well, we can be bigger. So he expands us to a quart and we feel empty. But then it begins to fill up again. But then he says, you could be a gallon. But then we feel empty again. So that was one of the ways that she used to describe, the prayer life and sometimes the experience of dryness, consolation, overflowing with consolations or dryness. That it's all part of him expanding our capacity.
Right, it's not that it's less, it's that you have the opportunity to be filled with more, and suddenly it feels like there's less. Because of what actually could be.
And St. Augustine talks about desire also expanding our capacities. So sometimes we're longing, we're thirsting, we're waiting, like the Psalms often say. But it's in that very longing, thirsting, waiting, we're saying, I'm here, Lord. I'm waiting, thirsting, longing. Fill me.
Right. Now, one of the last sections here is two wills, his and mine. You kind of mentioned that when we were talking a little bit about that. And we all know, and you would know very well, that Mother had a very strong will.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting that she's talking about, was she talking about this because this was her own struggle at times, to allow God's will to become her own?
I'm sure it springs from her own experience, but it's also a common experience.
Right.
Right? That we're not born and we don't live just in complete conformity with God's will and desiring to just live the commandments 100%. So we all have our own particular weakness, right? Our own particular fallenness that we struggle with.
Right.
And that can be the very instrument by which we grow in the opposite virtue, that struggle.
Well, she talks about the idea in here that a strong will is something admirable, but if that will is uncontrolled, it becomes a vehicle for evil.
Think about that if we just follow our whims all the time, it leads to addictions, it leads to destructions of families. If, a father of a family is just going to run off, at the least inconvenience or whatever, how just following our own whims and our own will can lead us to destruction and frustration ultimately. That we're not going to be happy in a self-centered life that's just following our own whims and desires.
Right.
It's directing our energies and our powers that God has given us in the best way, toward the good. That's choosing God's will, seeking his will.
Right, and I would think today, especially in some ways, because there seems to be, in a lot of times, people will take God's will, say it's God's will when it may be more of their own will, and they'll kind of interchange that with, well, I feel okay doing this, in which case my conscience is clear, when it's really their will that they're talking about.
Yeah, it is. We can deceive ourselves very quickly and easily if we want something bad enough. If we don't want to change the way that we're living. we can very quickly rationalize. We have a great capacity to rationalize. And that's why we're grateful for the church as our mother to give us the guidance of the teachings of Christ faithfully handed on to us.
Right. Love moves the will in whatever direction love takes. Mm-hmm. If our love is self-oriented, our actions will be geared towards self-satisfaction only. Unless our will is directed toward a higher good, we cannot reach our potential. So we have to be careful about what we're really focused on.
Do we want to just remain on the earthly level, or are we not being called higher, to a higher type of life, to a greater life, that God has called us above just the natural level? And that's a wonderful, wonderful truth. So we can live on a higher level by grace. Yes, we have our human nature, but God wants to elevate us by His grace to live the divine life, in a more full way.
Right. And in this section as well, Mother talks about the first step in the sense of knowing God's will, but that she says the second step is the more important, the most important one, is how do we live it out? How do we fulfill that? I think that's sometimes many of our fears for ourselves is, once I find out what God's will is for me, I may not be really willing to do what I now know He's asking me to do.
I've talked to young people who are afraid to ask God because they're afraid He's going to ask them to follow Him in a religious vocation. But He never goes against our deepest inclinations, which He has already planted in us. No, His will is never something we should be afraid of, but it's something that if we embrace is going to bring us to the fullness of our potential. That's what He wants for us.
In your experience in dealing with Mother over the years, can you recall a situation or some situations where you could see where Mother, in a sense, was struggling with what her will was for something, but seeing now that that wasn't what God's will was, and adjusting?
Well, I know she had a real desire to do some things, and she had this idea of starting something that would help unwed mothers and so on. She had a heart for them, and she had even talked to some people about it. But God had for her to be focused on the media mission that He had given to her. So that door never opened up. Right. Even though she had a heart for them, He wanted her to reach them in a different way, through her programs, through her counsel, through her understanding.
Right. That's interesting, because people used to say, well, why did your network work and the bishop's network didn't work? And there's a lot of technical reasons and programming reasons and distribution reasons, but Mother's reason was because that was a mission given to me. It wasn't given to the bishops. That's why we succeeded.
Yeah, and that's ultimately it. It's knowing His will and doing it. St. Teresa of Avila says, holiness is doing God's will.
Right.
So it's like by prayer, presence of the Blessed Sacrament, spiritual reading, spiritual guidance, we can come to know what God's will is for us. And then to carry it out is going to lead to our holiness. It's not always going to be easy to follow God's will, for you to come down here and to leave, your employment and to, all of that. It wasn't always easy. And yet your spiritual life, I'm sure, has advanced more because of doing His will.
It couldn't have gone backwards, so I can tell you that. So, thank you so much, Father Joseph, for spending the time with us on a final edition of our series talking about the Mother's mini books. This is Guide to Practical Holiness, the final one in the set, now available through EWTN's Religious Catalog. Thank you, Father Joseph. And you can get it EWTNRC.com, and pretty soon a whole set will be available, and you can check that out as well. Again, the title, A Guide to Practical Holiness by the one and only Mother Angelica. Check it out and join us next time right here on Bookmark. Thanks.